All right, guys, this lesson is for the layers and the parts of the sun. So the sun is not just one solid object that looks exactly the same and is all the same all the way around. There are specific parts to the sun. So this right here is your bell ringer. It's got 4 questions, and I want you to give me everything that you already know about the sun. I want you to answer these questions. You're not expecting to know this yet, but this is what I'm going to teach you in the lesson. So I kind of already want you to have an idea of what we're talking about today. So some of this you probably learned when you were in elementary school, but I do want you to think about the sun and go ahead and get your brain in that mindset and get ready to learn about the sun. So go ahead and pause the video and do your bell ringer. You don't have to write these necessarily. If you just want to type them in a Google Doc or just jot an answer down real quick, you can do that. But go ahead and pause this video and do that bell ringer. All right, now that you've done your bell ringer, we're going to talk about some of this stuff really quickly. So the sun does a lot of things for Earth. It keeps us warm. It keeps our atmosphere here. It keeps our atmosphere warm so that we don't get super, super cold in winter. And we don't get super, super cold at night. So we're able to stay warm. It gives us light so that we can see. It gives the plants light so they can grow. And as long as the plants are growing, the animals can eat those, and we can eat the plants, and we can eat the animals. So the sun gives us a whole lot of stuff. So we wouldn't be able to survive without the sun. Now, the rest of this stuff is going to be in the lesson for today. So we're going to talk about how many layers there are. We'll talk about what they look like, how hot they are, and that kind of stuff. Okay? So the rest of the answers for your bell ringer will be throughout the notes today. So this is the title for your notes. If you want to write that down, you can. And the first part of the sun we're going to talk about is the core. This is the very center of the sun, and this is where we get all the energy that powers the sun. This is where nuclear fusion happens. So nuclear fusion is the process that fuels the sun. So that's where the sun's power comes from, is nuclear fusion. And the core is about 27 million degrees Fahrenheit. That's really hot. All right, and the radiative zone is just above the core. It's on the outside, so just around that very centerpiece, that is what we call the radiative zone. All right, it's the middle layer between the core and the convective zone, so it's just kind of moving out a little bit, and it's around 27 million to 3.5 million degrees. So as we're moving out, it gets just a little bit cooler than the middle of the sun, but it is still really super hot. And now we get to the convective zone. This is where some neat things start to happen. All right, so the convective zone is where we see a lot of the movement and a lot of the changes in the sun itself. So there's a large bubbles of plasma pushing the heat up to the next layer. So that's what these circles are. They're showing you that convection. So it's just like when a pot of boiling water or a pot of water boils. That convection is what cycles the heat through that layer. So it's going to get down here to the bottom. It's going to get closer to that hotter part. It's going to get really, really hot, and heat makes things rise. So it's going to rise up closer to the surface. And once it gets to the surface, it's not going to be near all that heat. So it's going to cool down, and then it'll sink back down into the middle. So it's constantly cooling and then heating and then cooling and then heating. Okay. So it's just like that pot of boiling water. When that water gets cool, if it's up at the top, it's going to cool down a little bit. It'll sink back down into the bottom of the pot, and then it's going to heat up when it gets back down to the bottom of the pot that's sitting on the stove eye, and that heat is going to make it rise. So it's a continuous cycle of what we call convection. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is the very outside of the sun. This is the surface of the sun. So if you're looking at the sun, you see the photosphere. All right, this is where the sun's light comes from. And an easy way to remember that this is where the light comes from is if we look at the first part of this word right here. Photo means light. You have to have light to take a photograph. So photo means light, and that's where the light of the sun comes from, is from the photosphere. Now this is around 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's a lot cooler than the center of the sun. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the sun's atmosphere. The sun's atmosphere is around 3.5 million degrees Fahrenheit. So we just went from a surface that was around thousands of degrees hot, and we went to an atmosphere that is 3.5 million degrees Fahrenheit. So the sun's atmosphere is a lot hotter than just the surface of the sun. Okay? So the corona is what we call the hottest part of the sun. All right, now, we can't see the sun's atmosphere unless there's a solar eclipse or we have a special telescope. So instead of just having a regular plain old telescope, there will be a disc on the end of the telescope to block out the main part of the sun, and we'll be able to see the corona on the outside of it because we're just looking at the sun's atmosphere. Okay? Now, there's a lot of energy in the sun's atmosphere that's created by flares and prominences, and so that energy is going to be blown off towards Earth or towards other objects in outer space, and we call that solar wind. All right? Now, the sun is the largest and most massive object in our solar system, and it is about 93 million miles from Earth. And we also use that measurement as an astronomical unit. So when we talk about 1 AU, we're talking about just the distance from the sun to the Earth. Now, for light to make it to the Earth from the sun, it takes 8 minutes. So even though it's 93 million miles away from Earth, that light travels so fast that it only takes 8 minutes for us to see that light. Okay? Now, another way to say that is the distance to the sun is 8 light minutes. So it is the distance that light will travel in 8 minutes. All right, so now this is the other parts of the diagram of the sun, and we're going to use this to create a diagram later on. Okay, so the first part is the core of the sun. We talked about that is the very center of the sun. This is where the fusion happens that powers the sun and gives it its light and all that energy that it sends to us. The photosphere is the surface of the sun, and this is where the light comes from that we see when we look at the sun. The corona is the outermost layer of the sun's atmosphere, and it also gives off some light, but it's not very visible to us here on Earth unless it is during a solar eclipse or we have a special telescope to look at it with. All right, the next thing is sunspots. Sunspots are dark spots on the surface of the sun, and they are cooler. Okay, that's why they look darker, is because they're cooler. All right, so if we look at the sun over here that we're looking at, there are some spots that appear darker than others. Those are sunspots. Prominences are bright arch-like loops or rings that come off the surface of the sun. Okay, so if we look, I know this one's a little bit difficult to see, but you can tell that that's almost a loop coming off of the surface of the sun. So that is a prominence. All right. And the last part that we're going to talk about is a solar flare. And these are sudden, intense explosions that result in the changes in brightness on the surface of the sun. So we can see some little ones right here. There's one right here. So any place where we see just a little explosion of gas coming off the surface of the sun, that is a solar flare. All right. And this is what you're going to be doing in the next assignment. You're going to be creating a picture of the sun. You're going to have all 6 parts from this slide right here. So these are the parts that you're going to put on your diagram. And I am going to give you directions on how to do that later. But that will be your assignment from this lesson. All right, so this is kind of what your diagram will look like. All 6 parts are on here, and I haven't given you the answers on this slide, but they are in these notes, so they will be easy enough for you to label. This one right here is obviously a loop, so that is a prominence. We talked about that when we talked about the other parts of the sun. That's the core. It's the very center of the sun. So it's not difficult to see what they're pointing to and what it looks like. This is just an easier way to help you visualize what your diagram could look like. And that's it. That's what the sun looks like, and those are the parts we're going to learn about.